people that have grown up in very built-up areas, very big cities. So I'm from a great city, a bankrupt city in the UK called Birmingham, and didn't really have an awful lot of access to anything green, particularly as a child. But I remember one really kind of formative experience when I was about 4 or 5 years old. It was just before I went to school, and I went round to see my granddad, and he was planting potato peelings and carrot tops in his garden and growing his own vegetables. And it was the first time that I became aware of that whole process of, you know, you can actually take your food waste and turn it into something new, grow your own food, become aware of the whole process of growth and seasonality. And obviously, as a child, it amazed me at a very kind of basic level, but it made me start to think as I went through my early years about food, about where it came from. And it made me really passionate about making sure that we were eating things that were grown locally and things that were kind of fresh. And everybody back then had little vegetable patches and allotments if they didn't have a garden. That's one side of things, but the journey to where I am today is a little bit darker. And I'll tell you the story, and I apologise in advance if this offends anyone. I had always had a passion for bones, for skeletons, and trying to understand. I wanted to understand more about animals, but what was on the inside, how they were, the animals they were on the outside because of the bones that were in them. So I had to get my hands on some bones. Quick tip, you live in a city, head to the edge of the city, there's bound to be a road somewhere between the grey space and the green space, and unfortunately it tends to be littered with roadkill. So get yourself a bike with a basket on the back. When nobody's looking, collect the roadkill. Now, that will take you in one of two directions. I always have to say this just to kind of qualify things. You'll either become a serial killer, or potentially you'll become a National Museum curator, which is what happened to me. But what it meant was I started collecting the semi-flattened remains of these animals that I was finding, taking them home, had a very understanding father, gave me a little patch of ground, buried them. By the time I was 14, I had a reference collection. And it was that reference collection that fascinated me. It taught me an awful lot. I digested as much as possible that was available to me through the local library. Not an awful lot going on with the school. You know, I was at school in the 70s, left school in the early 80s. Not an awful lot of support outside of very kind of near horizons for the kids, expecting a lot of the kids to go into, and actually actively encouraging a lot of the kids to go into industry, factories and so on, which of course at that point in time were all starting to close down. If you had any interests, passions that you wanted to pursue outside of what was directly available in the school, there was nothing. There was no way to sort of support that. So it was an incredibly frustrating time, and it didn't mean that I went out and collected more roadkill. By that point, I had basically every flattened British mammal, apart from the really big ones, in my own collection. But it was a realization for me that in order to escape the pressures of my family and actually pursue this interest that I had to leave everything behind. That was the only way that I could really deal with the way things were going. And so by the time I was 17, I was gone, left the city behind, started working in the countryside with people in nature, learning about nature, learning about the kind of things that supported me in my development into this career. So very circuitous, incredibly circuitous. So a bit of an odd relationship with nature, but nonetheless a relationship.
Thank you, Richard. It's interesting for me to see how for both of them, they both had that relationship in very different ways at a very young age, and how that access is so crucial. So for Rachel, it was in school, and for Richard, it was outside of school. My experience is more similar to, well, not similar to Richard's in the way that I collected dead animals, but I didn't have access to that sort of education and more on-ground practical experience with nature. So my country, if you do have the privilege to have education, the way that biodiversity, the way that the climate crisis is explained is very scientific and technical and Western and foreign. So not at all contextualized to our experience, to our nature, despite the Philippines being one of the most beautiful and biodiverse countries in the world, especially for ocean systems. We didn't get to learn any of that. So my relationship to nature came because I saw destruction. So I grew up with these huge trees, and then I also at the same age of 7 or 9 or something, I came out after the typhoons, and the huge trees that I grew up with were on the ground, and I started crying. I don't remember this actually. My parents tell me this story, and they said, "Why are you crying, Mitzi?" And I'm like, "The earth is hurt. Something is wrong." But you know the way that the educational system happens, just like you, Rachel, you forget about this. You know, you go into high school, you go into university even sometimes, and they're telling you to, just as you said, the way that they're taught, the way that they teach you is not to teach you to go into these conservation related jobs or industries, but really to talk more about the foreign, the technical industries, the, you know, all these things. And so inherently, our relationship to nature is removed from us at a very young age. Like as kids, we all like to play outside, and then we're put into classrooms and then separated. And then the access to nature that we will usually have are curated nature. If you have green spaces, they're usually parks. That's not wild. It's very clean, it's very chosen, it's very beautiful. It's not what nature truly is. And then there also comes the conversation of what else is part of nature. Humans are often removed from the conversation, and that is how I'm going to transition to my next question of what are the issues around biodiversity that you both are working on, and what do you think still needs to be done?
Go first?
No, after you.
Once again. Again, I started on food systems issues, and I was mentioning how deeply interconnected our food is with so many of the other issues that we see. When it comes to our Amazon, there's a huge problem right now with the introduction of genetically engineered trees, and that has implications for contaminating and really impacting all of our forests yet to come. Brazil's Cerrado forest and terrestrial land is one of the most at-risk spaces right now, and it actually is 5% of diversity of species, and it's held all in this one area of Brazil, and yet through carbon offsets, which is a controversial topic in a place like COP, people are paying carbon offsets to plant trees somewhere in the world, and they don't oftentimes know where it's headed. And in reality, it's generally ending up in indigenous people's lands, and they are being displaced as a result. So genetically engineered trees are now ending up in the Cerrado terrestrial space. It's a savanna and forested area as well as wetlands, which all three of those are some of the greatest carbon sinks that we have at our disposal. And they're being destroyed to create monocultures of genetically engineered trees that are being sprayed with Roundup, which is one of the most pervasive and destructive herbicides on this planet. And so we need to start really thinking deeper about our connection to nature, and it sounds good to buy offsets and be a part of the solution, but what does that solution really look like? And is it holistic? And is it working really with the land, or is it working with corporations' profits and their pockets? And I'd like to be a part of the real solutions that are on the ground. For us, pollinators were a huge part of creating solutions. So let's create pollinator spaces, and let's teach kids about pollinating and what pollinators are. A huge part of it too was teaching about these sensitive areas in the Amazon that are being destroyed. And we worked on cross-campaign issues to remove some of the really toxic pesticides and herbicides in our food systems that are really impacting every single level of our lives. For instance, neonicotinoids and herbicides like glyphosate, as I mentioned, are killing off our pollinators in drastic levels. And without pollinators, we do not have food. 1 in 3 bites of food is pollinated by a bee. And so if you don't have bees, if you don't have pollinators, you do not have anything to eat. And that's where the climate change topic becomes a lot more niche, because I feel like we say climate change a lot, but we don't look at the very small intersections that actually impact biodiversity and different areas within that biodiverse biome that we have that are contributing to the climate crisis. When we're cutting down our rainforests, we are releasing emissions. When we are having factory farms, it's releasing methane. And we need to start looking at those niche areas and taking action on them individually, and that's how we can really restore nature relationships within each of these industries.
That's really interesting that you take note of that, where it is true, like a lot of times, not just world leaders, but we even have the fault of seeing climate change as just the emissions, just the fossil fuels, but not looking at the biodiversity aspect of it. And something that really terrifies me is that as we more and more push into renewable energy, the mining industry for those minerals, for renewable energies, what does that mean for our biodiversity, for our indigenous peoples who live on that land? And so that's a conversation that we have to be having at the same time. But it's difficult to have these conversations because they're such huge topics and they're such large aspects, and a lot of negotiators or governments will say, oh, that's not climate change anymore. That's biodiversity. And like, okay, but what are we actually fighting for? Is it just, are we fighting for emissions or are we fighting for life? And so that, I have the same question for you, Richard, so feel free to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've always found it kind of frustrating and also quite fascinating that there's such a divide put between climate change and biodiversity, and yet they're so intricately linked. You know, good biodiversity in an area equals healthy ecosystems, and those healthy ecosystems do so much to stabilize climate and help with climate change. So for me, from my perspective, being able to work with the research collections at the Natural History Museum it's a joy. It's been an absolute joy. I've been there, like I say, for just over 30 years. And one of the things that I was fortunate enough to do was get a job working with marine mammals, working with the largest animals on the planet, and using the reference collections that we have, specimens that were collected over centuries from different parts of the oceans, from places now where those animals don't exist anymore because of commercial whaling, factory whaling at the start of the 20th century. And this, again, might sound counterintuitive, but I wanted to sort of contextualize the value of these collections because back in 1999, our museum was given a donation of about 6,500 teeth from sperm whales that were taken during British whaling activities from about 1947 to roughly about 1960. And those teeth, those 6,500 teeth, represent roughly 2,000 sperm whales, individual sperm whales. The teeth were being taken from the animals at the time by the whalers, by the scientists working for the whaling factories, to try and understand the ages of the animals that they were killing. And so some of the teeth were half-sectioned, and within these teeth you can see the growth layers, and there was an age determination made on those. When that collection came to our museum in 1999, I saw it then as an opportunity to do several things, one of which was investigate the loss of genetic diversity from these populations of sperm whales over this period of time from quite a broad range across the South Atlantic, and look at what we'd lost. And one of the things that you may have heard over the past couple of decades that's been a real focus for bodies like the International Whaling Commission is trying to reconstruct pre-whaling population sizes to understand the scale of the loss. Genetically, there are ways that you can do that. But the other thing that has been absolutely fascinating for me, and again, it's a little bit like science fiction, the value of this material. The way that we work with the specimens now is completely unlike the way that we would have worked with them 30 years ago because of the techniques that are available to us. So inside those teeth, as well as information about the genetics and the haplotypes, the unique haplotypes that have been lost, there's information about diet, there are hormones in there, there's information about migration, movements, a whole range of things. So we have an opportunity to create a data set and generate evidence. And of course, for us at the museum, it's all about evidence. And of course, when you have evidence, it's pretty hard to argue with that. So a body of evidence that we can use to help inform the debate about what happened in the past, what we need to do in the future, setting up marine protected areas where whales can be left unperturbed, not bothered in the future. But the key thing is making people aware of the scale of the destruction that happened previously and ensuring to a greater or lesser degree that we never go back in that direction.
Thank you, Richard. That's a very, very important note. Um, I wanted to ask the both of you now, when you're talking to people about the work that you're doing about biodiversity, what are some of the most common misconceptions that you've um, received or been asked about, and how do you usually respond to them?
I think one of the most common misconceptions, especially when you're working in biodiverse food systems, is that we're not able to feed the world while also keeping biodiversity in check. And that's completely not true. Majority of the farmers that are feeding all of us as is are smallholder farmers from the global south, from Africa. I mean, majority of them are already using regenerative methods. The problem is the large-scale industrial farms that hold up to 75% of commercialized land, and they're growing monocultures of corn, soy, canola, cotton. And of course, you can't have a biodiverse system when Monsanto and Bayer and all these massive corporations are making a ton of money. And so it doesn't work in the same system. Can you have regenerative agriculture that feeds the world? Absolutely, and there's studies that point to that now more than ever. The United Nations has done studies showing the amount of food produced over an agroecology place in 11 years produced more. It helped the farmers to rebuild local economies. It actually helped to mitigate local climate change effects in those areas, provided cooling. If we can farm in traditional ways and learn